there were secondary explosives that were caused by the fact that munitions were stored in the basement of the mosque. In other words, Tim Collins, on the site inspection, a former British officer who served in Iraq, completely contradicts the statements of Travers, which were not made by inspecting a mosque. In fact, Travers says, I saw 2 mosques in the whole Gaza Strip. Just hear what Collins has to say with an on-site inspection on a mosque in Gaza.
In Iraq, this mosque was hit by an Israeli airstrike in the early days of the war last December. I wanted to see for myself why it was targeted. Whenever it came in here, it penetrated straight through the roof, bringing daylight in here, and it's absolutely destroyed the place. The allegation was that this was used as a storage facility for weapons. I have to say, what was commonplace in Iraq also seemed to be evident in Gaza as well. Down in the cellar of the mosque, there was clear evidence of secondary explosions. It's my opinion that the only thing that could have caused this was if explosives had been stored here. In my view, that's the only logical explanation. This is the scene of one of the most tragic incidents.
That's a professional military analysis. Not simply asserting anybody who says that weapons were stored in mosques is anti-Islamic. That was the basis on which, obviously, Travers worked. Now, I think one of the problems with the professionalism of Travers, and we're reaching a conclusion here, is that Travers does not ask hard questions. Remember, he is the military man on the Goldstone mission. When Palestinian witnesses came in July to meet with the Goldstone mission and meet with all 4 members, he was the man who was supposed to ask the military-related questions. The others were international lawyers or judges. So one would expect from him the kind of military questions that an intelligence analyst, that a man from the planning branch would ask. For example, did he ask witnesses who spoke about a house being destroyed whether they were members of the Izzuddin al-Qassam units? No. He didn't even ask the question. Did he ask them whether there were Grad rockets stored in their basement, like in the case of many of these mosques? He didn't ask the question. Now, how do I know, and how does Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Levy know they didn't ask those questions? Because those interviews with the Palestinians in Gaza, like the first clip you saw, were put on the website of the United Nations. So if you have the time and you want to spend a few hours reviewing all the testimony of Palestinian witnesses, you can do it. And you'll find questions like, how do you explain how Israeli soldiers shot at Palestinian children? But you won't find the kind of professional military questions that a good military analyst will ask. And that, I think, for us, leads us to the conclusion that Travers was not as serious and was not a professional analyst of the developments that occurred in Operation Cast Lead. And that raises serious questions about the reliability of the whole military analysis in that report. Let me add something which I did not want to make the central subject of today, but nonetheless hovers over everything he is saying, especially his very harsh accusations against the state of Israel and against the morality of Israeli soldiers. At one point, he is confronted with the fact that the British didn't go along with many of the conclusions of the report. They abstained in various UN fora. British military men like Tim Collins, like Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, had serious doubts about the Goldstone report. And so all of a sudden, Travers makes the following statement. Britain's foreign policy interests in the Middle East seem to be influenced strongly by Jewish lobbyists. That's a quote. Now, unless Travers himself corrects this statement that he made, it's as plain as day that it has anti-Semitic overtone. And it raises questions about his own motivation and his own reliability as an analyst on anything in the Middle East. I would say he cannot be an analyst on any military issue. and should not be employed by the United Nations. But what I would expect is that given his statement, and given his other statements that fly in the face of the facts of the Gaza war, of Operation Cast Lead, I would expect that Justice Richard Goldstone should repudiate Colonel Travers and completely reject the conclusions he reached as a result of Travers' work. Thank you. I turn the floor over to Lieutenant Colonel. Sure, you have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Do you think that it was a mistake for Israel not to cooperate with the Goldstone Commission rather than have to, scramble to present Israel's case after the fact?
Let me tell you the problem. I understand the temptation to say, well, had Israel cooperated, the report would have come out differently. There are a number of Israelis who were willing to provide material to the Goldstone mission. There's a Colonel Daniel Reisner, who actually, formerly of the Israeli
Military Advocate General.
Thank you very much. Military Advocate General's office. And Colonel Reisner actually flew to Geneva and made an appearance before the Goldstone mission. And what he found is while there's plenty of Palestinian testimony on their website, his testimony was ignored. He felt it wasn't dealt with. And he himself, because he actually testified there, said, you know what? If Israel cooperated with the Goldstone mission, it wouldn't have improved anything. Now I'm adding, from the material that I've seen with Travers, this looked like a kangaroo court. And I don't think anything Israel would have done would have improved the results. And let me bring it home, and I'll ask also Yoni to expand on this. How did Goldstone reach the conclusion, or how did the mission reach the conclusion, that Israel deliberately killed civilians? When I was at Brandeis debating Goldstone, he specifically went into this. He said, I wanted to find very clear instances where there was no fog of war, in which Palestinians were killed by IDF fire, but there were no military operations in the area. And so he said he found 11 instances like this. What's his source of information? There was no Palestinian fire and the IDF was firing. Palestinian testimony. But as I told you earlier, in paragraph 440 of the report, he says the Palestinian witnesses were afraid to speak about Palestinian military operations. So how can you say in one part of the report the Palestinians were afraid, the witnesses were afraid to talk about Palestinian military operations? In another part of the report you say, because there were no military operations in the area, Israel was deliberately killing civilians. It's a fundamental contradiction. Now this is where our work here at the Jerusalem Center comes in. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Dechoach Halevi had been researching the Gaza war on the websites of Hamas, Islamic Jihad. And what he found was that, in fact, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad took credit for Palestinian military operations against the IDF precisely in the area where Palestinian witnesses in Gaza were too afraid to relate to those particular instances. Now, could Colonel Travers and the military analysts of Goldstone go on into the same websites as Lieutenant Colonel Halevi? Certainly. Open source material. It's relatively easy to do. You don't have to have a big intelligence agency working for you. Just go to the open source material in Arabic. Well, now I'm going to share with you inside information. Lieutenant Colonel Halevi sent me 60 pages in Arabic of what's called the Hamas War Diary.